Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Neena Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host, Neena Mishra. I'm working from my home in Chicago, and joining me now via Skype from Kansas City is Brad Lonkar, our favorite biotech expert. And the US now has more than 400,000 confirmed cases of the coronavirus, while the death toll exceeds 14,000. But in the past few weeks, we have heard about some encouraging developments regarding testing for the virus and vaccines and drugs to treat the infections. So we thought it would be a good time to get Brad on the program to learn more about these developments. Brad, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Everybody here is safe. We're in lockdown in Kansas City, like everywhere else. So trying to get through this. And Ina, thanks a lot for having me back. And I hope that you're staying safe in Chicago and that everyone is well there too. I know these are very difficult times. So thanks a lot for having me on to talk about this.
Yes, sure. These are very challenging times. And I apologize to our listeners for the audio quality, because we are doing this via a Skype conference call, so the audio quality may not be up to the mark. But let's start with the basic question, Brad. What exactly are coronaviruses? So I understand that these have been around for quite some time, but this newly identified type, which is also called novel coronavirus, it emerged in China in December 2019, and that has caused this COVID-19 disease, which is a respiratory illness. So tell us what exactly is COVID-19 and why is it so deadly?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say I am a biotech expert. I've been doing this my whole life, and I invest exclusively in biotech. I'm not a medical doctor, and I want to say that because we're going to be talking about a lot of medicines today. And given the gravity of the situation, I want to make sure that nobody out there takes anything that I say as medical advice. So if you're experiencing symptoms or something, you should always consult a doctor. So I just want to get that out. But let's talk biotech. So yeah, coronavirus. So the word corona means crown, and this relates to what these look like under the microscope. So there's a lot of different types of viruses, and coronavirus is one type, and there are many different types of coronaviruses that cause everything from the common cold to very serious respiratory illnesses, and this is one of those that causes serious respiratory illnesses. And so corona gets back to how it looks under the microscope. So coronaviruses are typically spherical, and they have on the outside of them what are called spike proteins. And those are the proteins that interact with our human cells that are kind of the bridge between the virus and the human cell. And because those are kind of on the outside of the spherical virus, it looks like a crown, hence coronavirus. So this is a type of coronavirus that happens to be of the very serious variety that's causing a very serious respiratory illnesses in many of the people who contract it.
That's helpful. And today, in fact, there have been some encouraging signs that the outbreak is plateauing in some hotspots like New York. That's thanks mainly to some very aggressive containment measures, which are being implemented all over the country. But we are still very far from return to normalcy. And any plans to reopen the economy would greatly depend on very aggressive testing and surveillance measures. So there have been some developments on testing systems too. And in fact, there is an Abbott Laboratories test that provides results in 15 minutes. So could you tell us a little bit about the developments on the testing front first?
Yeah, absolutely. So, unfortunately, when we look back on this, this is an area where our country definitely was not prepared as it relates to testing.
Correct.
And essentially, what has happened, so testing has improved a lot over the last previous week. So when this first came out about a month ago and testing was very limited, we had very rudimentary testing procedures that kind of had to be done manually. And so you saw a lot of statistics where, states only could do like 100 tests a day. And the reason for that was using like the most basic testing principle possible. And that was literally being done manually by people in labs. And so you only had hundreds of tests available per state. The big thing that really changed that is companies like Roche and others developed what's called high throughput testing that allowed us to test, thousands of people a day, in shorter time periods, over 24 to 48 hours. So that was kind of a middle step that really improved things. And then you just pointed out something that I think really is potentially a game changer, the Abbott test. That's what we call point of care. And what we mean by point of care is in a lot of doctors' offices today, they have this Abbott machine literally sitting on their desk. And so a test can be done and run within minutes. I think Abbott said for a positive test, it comes out in 10 to 15 minutes and just a few minutes longer for a negative test. So that's really important because to get back to work one day, we are going to require massive testing, way more than is happening now because, one of the reasons we're in lockdown right now everywhere is we really don't know who has it and who's spreading it and all of that. And so to have any chance of getting back to normalcy one day, we've got to have widespread testing, not just for people who have symptoms. So those are the people, because there's a shortage of tests today, that's who's getting tested are only people who, there's a strong reason to believe that they have this and that they have symptoms. To get us to a point where society will get back to somewhat of normalcy, we've got to have widespread testing to the degree that many other people are getting tested, not just those who have symptoms and, who we strongly believe are sick. And so that's where point of care testing is going to make a big difference. And, there's even companies that are talking about doing home testing one day. So, for example, there's a company called OraSure that does a home HIV test. So you can buy that in a drugstore and swab your mouth, and then you send it through FedEx or UPS to them, and you get an answer back, in a relatively short time frame. Those are the types of things that we're going to need to really do widespread testing to get people back to work. And we're making progress. The Abbott test is really a big thing, and there will be others that roll out testing like it. So we definitely started from an unfortunate place as it came to testing, but there's been improvements over time, and I think even that it'll even get better in the future.
Yes, aggressive testing measures are very important, but we know that long-term solution to tackle this virus lies in effective vaccines. which can be used to prevent infections, and therapies that can be used to treat this virus. And in fact, coronavirus has now become the biggest priority for most biotech companies. And according to the Wall Street Journal, more than 140 experimental drug treatments and vaccines for the coronavirus are currently in development worldwide. But most of those are in early stages. 11 are currently in clinical trials. And in fact, if we include drugs that are approved for other diseases, then there are 254 clinical trials currently going on for the virus. That includes testing, treatments, and vaccines. So these are all going at record pace, but even then we will not know for many months whether they will work. So when can we expect vaccines to prevent infections or drugs to treatment? Why such a long wait for them?
Yeah, so first of all, you posed this perfectly. One thing that I think is important is a lot of technical terms are being thrown at the general public. This isn't just a biotech story, of course. This is a world event and everybody is trying to understand it. And a lot of medical terms are being thrown at people and it's confusing. And you said some really important things. So let's define our terminology first. So as you described, there are a few ways to think about this. So the first are vaccines. So vaccines are meant to prevent a disease from occurring in healthy people. And then you have treatments that are meant to help people who are already stricken with it. So I think, number one, it's important to define, these very basic medical terms, because a lot of people get confused by, things that simple. And so it's important to know who's working on what and over what time frame. So let's, as you asked, let's talk about vaccines specifically. So vaccines are a very difficult business and historically took a very long time to develop. But we have some new powerful tools that have allowed some vaccine developers to race into clinical trials, unlike we would have been able to do in the past. So one company you might see in the news a lot is called Moderna. So Moderna has worked with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the government. And Moderna has a technology platform called messenger RNA. And that's allowed that technology has allowed them to get into clinical trials very quickly. So when this first happened in China, some Chinese researchers posted to the internet the RNA sequence, so the genetic sequence of the virus, to the internet. And this mRNA platform is so promising and that they were able to take that sequence and to design a vaccine and get it into a clinical trial, so literally inject it into a human within 63 days, which is amazing because in the past, it might have taken a year or more to develop a vaccine. In fact, the last time this happened, the Ebola crisis, which was in late 2014, a vaccine for that was just approved in late December of last year, so 5 years later. So that tells you, yeah, that gives you an idea of how long vaccines used to take. So the fact that we were able, or a company was able to get one into clinical trials in 60 days is really amazing. Now, that's the good news. Now there is kind of a bad news part of this. One thing about it that I don't think has really been explained to the general public well enough is this messenger RNA platform is entirely experimental. We don't know if it's going to work. This company, Moderna, doesn't have any other vaccines or treatments that they've ever successfully developed. This is brand new, so it might not work. Now, there are other companies that are developing vaccines that are more tried and true, but those may take a little longer. So this messenger RNA platform is promising enough that it was worth rushing to trials like we've done, but it is important to know that it might not work. But there are other things behind it that may take a little longer that, maybe the odds of working are a little higher just based off of previous experiences. Now, another thing that's important to know about vaccines is, as you described in your question, sadly, they're going to take a long time to develop. And the reason for that is because these are new. And when you're developing vaccines, number one, you have to be very careful about safety. You don't want to harm people. And number two, developing one that works is easier said than done. Like I said, for Ebola, it took 5 years. So because it's brand new, it's going to take a minimum of a year to develop a successful one. Now, there are some things, because this is such a global emergency, that can be done as short-term solutions. So, for example, if during the initial testing of a vaccine like the Moderna one, if it's proven that it's safe, and if it seems to suggest that it might work, if it's producing the right immune response in the patients, what a company like that might be able to do, working with the FDA, is maybe in the fall they can give it to healthcare workers and other high-risk groups while it's still being tested in a wider population to really know for sure if it works. But if you have a pretty good idea that it's safe and you have some evidence to believe that it works, there are things that companies can do like that. So I wouldn't be surprised to see intermediate steps like that would kind of otherwise be unprecedented. But when you have an emergency as serious as this one, you have to do everything possible to really try to help things. So that's the way to think about vaccines.
Right. Yeah, in fact, I heard Bill Gates saying that his foundation is going to spend billions of dollars to fund the construction of factories for the most promising vaccines. And he talked about 7. And he also mentioned that actually only 2 of those vaccines may ultimately be successful. So I don't know whether Moderna is included in those 7 or not, but everyone is trying to do whatever they can because this is such a health emergency.
That's right. And one thing that hasn't been in the news in the West a lot is, I follow China biotech very closely. There's a Chinese company called CanSino Biologics that also raced in the development of their vaccine, and they started dosing patients a day after Moderna. And that's more of a traditional vaccine. It uses a technology called adenovirus 5 as its vector. And then you have other companies in the US. Johnson & Johnson is a big vaccine company, and they're developing more of a traditional vaccine. And I think they said that they'll be able to start trials sometime this summer, which is pretty quick for a traditional vaccine. So the way to simply think about vaccines is we've raced some to the market. Those are kind of experimental. We hope that they'll work, but we're not sure if they will. But there's a whole spectrum behind them of companies that are using other vaccine technologies that may take a little longer, but are promising as well. But the earliest we can expect something like that for the wider population is a year minimum, even in the best case scenario.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the possible treatments because they may be available earlier than vaccines. And I read that some of the existing drugs which are used for treating malaria, HIV, arthritis, Ebola, etc., they are being examined whether they can be repurposed to treat COVID-19. And In fact, President Trump has called chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine a potential game changer for this disease. And but some experts have said that this drug may not be safe for treating COVID-19, particularly for heart patient. And then there's one from Gilead Sciences. It's an antiviral drug, remdesivir. So could you tell more about some of the existing drugs that could be used for this disease?
Yeah, that's right. I have to say, I'm impressed. You've really done your homework. You know this stuff very well, and you're exactly right. So for treatments, so that second category, there's two ways to think of treatments, and you're describing the first way. So whenever you have an emergency like we have, the first thing that you do is you throw at it whatever you've already got. It might not be perfect, but maybe it'll make a difference. And those things that you brought up are in that category. So there's a lot of drugs out there that were designed for other things, and in some cases are literally sitting on a shelf somewhere that we're trying with this to see if it will make a difference. Now, I don't think any of these will be a silver bullet because, again, they're not specifically designed for this problem. But if something can just make a difference, for a group, for a certain percentage of patients, that would be a big deal, because the problem right now is we're facing peak uncertainty. And if we can just have something that makes a difference, I think that would be a big positive for the world. So the two you mentioned, the one that's in the news a lot is hydroxychloroquine. And that's the one that President Trump and others have really been highlighting. And that's a tough one. So I think they're highlighting that for two reasons. The number one reason they're highlighting it is because it's a pill and it's generic and we already have a lot of it. So that would be a very easy thing to roll out. It's already being rolled out, in New York and the hotspot areas. That would be a very easy thing to roll out if it really makes a difference. And the other thing is I think the reason why they're big on it is there has been some anecdotal stories about other doctors who have been using it who think that it might work. So there was a small study in France that suggested that. There's a lot of researchers in China that used it and believe in it. The health group that treated all the patients in Shanghai wrote a paper saying they believed it was the best treatment and it was really their go-to. And there was even an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from a doctor where I live in Kansas City who said he's been using it and believes that it's making a difference. Now, anytime the president gets involved in something, it becomes very political. And now this drug is a big, subject of debate. And, there's a lot of reasons behind that. What I would say is it is anecdotal and we do not know if this works. And what has to happen, and actually this is happening, is while you're rushing it out, in this emergency situation, as you're giving it to people, you also have to give it in the context of collecting data and running a legitimate clinical trial, because that's the only way to know for sure if something like this works. And, we've talked in the past a lot. I focus on cancer a lot. And one thing I'll say in my experience as someone who focuses on cancer is you hear positive anecdotes all the time about experimental cancer medicines that once you run a real clinical trial to get a definitive answer, a lot of times, sadly, it doesn't turn out the way that you would hope. So what I would caution people about is, we're all crossing our fingers that this works. And, it's they're doing the right thing in rushing this out, to people in need during this emergency situation while running, trials and collecting data. But it's important to know that until we get that data back, nobody knows for sure if that works or not. And it's important to get that answer because, there actually are side effects to that. And you don't want to harm people. And you also don't want to, of course, give people something that's, futile and not working. So it's important for us to get the answer. The second drug that you mentioned is one that I personally am circling, and it's the one that I'm most encouraged about. So that's remdesivir from Gilead Sciences. So as you said, that's an antiviral medicine, and again, it wasn't designed specifically for this, but it has had some encouraging signs against past coronaviruses. They tested this in the lab against SARS and MERS, which were both coronaviruses, and there was some positive results there. And just scientifically, I don't want to get too, nerdy into the science, but the polymerase that this blocks is similar to what's the makeup of this particular coronavirus. So, I think with this drug, I'm crossing my fingers. I think where there's smoke, there's fire. The fact that the U.S. government, the Chinese government, and the World Health Organization really highlighted this one as the most promising, I think is right. But just like with hydroxychloroquine, we do not yet know if this works. It's been rolled out both for emergency use and in clinical trials. And the cool thing about this one is we're going to get back some of this clinical trial data any day now. So an answer from that one could be coming within days. We might know if this is working or not. There were a couple clinical trials in China, and also Gilead has done some other clinical trials in the U.S. and other parts of the world, and we expect to hear back on those very soon. So I would watch that one. I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet, but for some patients, it might make a difference. They're testing this both in severe patients and moderate patients. And my guess is the earlier you start treatment, the better. So I would say the severe patients, that's going to be a close one. I would have more optimism about moderate and early stage patients. So we'll have to see how that goes. But I mean, if it can make a difference just for anybody, that will be a positive. That will take some risk of this off the table. So we'll have to watch and see how it goes. And those are just two examples. There are other companies that are also repurposing other drugs. There's a Japanese company that has one and other things like that. So a lot of people are trying existing medicines against this.
That's very helpful. And as you mentioned, these may not be perfect solutions, but even if they help a little bit, they are worth trying. And there are many scientists and drug companies that are working on entirely new drugs targeting this particular disease. So could you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there are companies that are designing drugs that are tailor-made for this. Now, the catch with those is it's kind of like vaccines. Because they're brand new, they'll have to be tested much more extensively, and that will take more time. But they also might, work a lot better in the long run. And so the one that I would really circle there is Regeneron. They have a really cool technology. So they've spent over a decade trying to essentially change the immune system in mice to make them have basically a human immune system. And then what they do with these mice that they've designed is they challenge them, with the virus. And just like a human, these mice make antibodies against the virus. So then Regeneron takes those antibodies and they try to figure out which ones might be the most promising ones to use. And then they grow them in vats and turn them into a treatment. So the cool thing about this technology is that it can be, depending on which dose that you use, it can be used either as a treatment for, very severe patients, or as kind of like a preventative vaccine, what we call passive immunity. And so that technology can be used in both ways. And to me, that's definitely the most interesting and most promising of the companies that are making tailor-made things. And I've always believed that Regeneron, like if before all of this had started, even if you would have asked me of the large biotech companies, who's doing the best science today, I would say Regeneron. And so I just have a lot of admiration for their work. And this process that I used with the mice, they actually used that against Ebola and succeeded. And I think Ebola is much more severe, and I think a much bigger challenge when it comes to something like this. So the fact that they used the same process against Ebola and essentially succeeded, I think says a lot about how promising it might be against coronavirus. So I would circle them. And actually, there was one thing I forgot to mention in the going back to our previous category of repurposing existing drugs. Some companies, including Regeneron, are testing something called IL-6, and IL-6. So, when you have one of the side effects of the severe patients who have this coronavirus is their immune systems essentially go haywire and into overdrive. That's called cytokine release syndrome. And drugs like these IL-6 drugs, Roche has one as well, help with that side effect. And so Regeneron has a second treatment, an IL-6 treatment that's in clinical trials right now that we should learn about in the coming weeks or months, trying to tamper down one of the major side effects of the severe patients. So this is a company that's really working on this in all regards. There's another company called Vir Biotechnology that's also using this antibody approach. They've partnered with a Chinese company called Wuxi Biologics, and also with Glaxo, which has a lot of expertise in vaccines. And they're also taking the antibody approach to this, both as a treatment and as a preventative measure, depending on how you dose it.
Very interesting. And since you mentioned antibodies, I had a question about convalescent plasma. I read that the FDA approved this treatment for coronavirus patients in March. And this also involves basically collecting blood plasma from someone who has had this disease and who has recovered. So the blood plasma is transfused into someone who is infected with the virus in the hopes that antibodies from the recovered person will be able to help the person who is sick. So could you tell us a little bit about convalescent plasma and how it helps coronavirus patients?
Yeah. And, this, number one, you described it very well. And this is something that in medicine has been practiced for decades. And so there's, strong reason to believe that it's promising. And there's a really simple idea behind it. And again, you described it very well, which is when somebody is infected with a virus like this and recovers, their immune system, learns from that and creates what we call neutralizing antibodies. And so the idea behind this simply is to draw their blood and separate out the plasma, which holds the immune cells, and to transfer that to a severe patient, who's really in a difficult situation. So the term that we have for this is passive immunity. So what that means is this, the patient who's, severely impacted by this is their immune system is not, has not been able to fight this on its own. And so you're basically taking the immune system, the immune cells from somebody who's already recovered from this and transferring it to the severe patient. And so that's being used, in very serious cases of this, as kind of a last resort for patients who really need it. So the catch with that is it's kind of, logistically challenging, and of course not as simple as taking a pill or, just having a ready-made treatment, infused in your body. So that will, really only be appropriate for severe patients who are in a difficult situation. But for those types of patients, that might work. Again, it's worked in the past for other things. And there are anecdotal cases of it working, during this emergency throughout the world. And so I think it's definitely, something that's promising, and I can understand why the FDA gave it a green light, so quickly.
So I wanted to ask you what investors need to know, because many investors think about investing in the companies that are developing either testing solutions or working on a vaccine or a treatment for this disease. And in fact, you mentioned Johnson & Johnson vaccine earlier, and Johnson & Johnson said that they do not expect to profit from this vaccine. So do you think it makes sense for investors to look at these companies and invest in them, because there would be so much demand for these vaccines or treatments whenever they are available?
Yeah, it's another excellent question, and I have a very strong opinion about this. I am very proud of the way that these companies have risen to the occasion. The biotech industry has really had an all hands on deck, let's figure something out attitude about this. And I'm really proud of the way that that the world is seeing that. The reputation of the pharmaceutical industry has been frankly terrible over previous years, with drug pricing and the opioid scandal and all of, things like that have rightfully angered the general public. And it's a shame, because 99% of people in this industry are good, smart people trying to do the right thing. And I think the public is seeing that today. But as far as investors go, I strongly urge caution when it comes to playing what I call virus stocks. Whenever this happens, all of these companies put out press releases saying they're working on things, many of which are legitimate, great companies doing great science like the Regenerons and Modernas of the world, and some of which are not legitimate, that are just trying to take advantage of the situation and, get a pop in their stock and maybe raise some money and things like that. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Companies do not expect to make money from this. Johnson & Johnson's not the only one to say that. Others have as well. Gilead said they've already created, I think, 1.5 million doses of remdesivir, and they're not going to charge anybody for any of that. And so, I would caution people, these types of events, I understand this one's kind of unprecedented on a much bigger scale than we've seen in the past, but these types of events are not the types of things that companies really make money on. And in this case especially, I don't think any companies really will. And so, valuations can get out of hand, even with the legitimate companies that are doing legitimate science. And it's also, by the way, really hard to pick a winner. I mean, there's not going to be dozens of winning therapies that come out of this. There's probably going to be one or two. And to pick that winner is really difficult. So I strongly urge non-biotech investors who think, companies are going to make billions and billions, I urge caution about playing individual stocks. Now, I will say, I think that our industry could be, could have a lot of momentum coming out of this, and may be one of, the better industries to think about over the long term. I think people are going to really place importance on their health after this, and I think governments will too. So I saw a few weeks ago, Credit Suisse had a great survey in China. They surveyed Chinese consumers, and they said, after this tragedy is over one day, what are the things that you're likely to spend more money on? And what are the things that you're likely to spend less money on? And the top two things that the respondents said they'd spend more money on was healthcare and education. And the types of things they said they would spend less money on was like dining out and travel and, things like that. So I think there's a real good argument to make that investing broadly in healthcare or broadly in biotech might be a wise thing to do, coming out of this, because I do think it's going to be a sector of focus. And I think governments are going to really, encourage investing in this sector. But as far as playing individual, again, quote unquote, virus stocks, if past history is any guide, in the past, these shooting stars have all come down and people have lost a lot of money on it. So I would be very careful about playing individual names, in relation to headlines that we're seeing every day. That's a very dangerous and risky thing to do.
That's very helpful, Brett. I agree that it makes a lot more sense to invest in a broad healthcare or biotech ETF rather than trying to pick winners in this scenario. And it's really good to know that companies are not planning to make any money on these vaccines or drugs, but they are just sincerely trying to contribute towards finding a solution. And let's hope that we find a solution soon. And let's hope that this crisis will be over sooner than we currently anticipate. Thanks so much for joining us today, Brad, and stay safe.
You too. Always my pleasure, and hope you and everyone out there stay safe as well. We will get through this. I'm remaining optimistic. There will be better days ahead. So we're going through some tough times now, but we'll get through it. I'm sure about that.
Sure we will. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening. If you want to learn more, please visit the ETF section of Zacks.com. Make sure to be on the lookout for the next edition of ETF Spotlight, and also make sure to subscribe. And stay safe, be well, everyone. Thank you.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.